Hello, my name is Stephanie Hare at Oxford Analytica, and I'm here in conversation today with Dr. David Hine of Christ Church, University, Oxford. Thank you very much for joining us today, David.
Great pleasure.
What we are talking about today is first to acknowledge that EU leaders are beginning a 2-day summit in which they will be discussing the French push for a banking union, German dreams for a new EU treaty, and of course the long-standing anticipated request that Spain is going to make, either to have a private or precautionary credit line or a full sovereign bailout request. So that's what's happening in Europe now. That's what's on their agenda. But what is on our agenda for today is what is not going to be on theirs, and that's Italy. Now, we know that we have general elections coming up in the spring of 2013. Talk us through that, though, because there's a lot of steps to get from now until then.
There certainly are. In terms of public policy, there's the budget. That's always tricky, but basically the Italians are kind of on track. But they've got to have a general election because it's really all about what happens after the election, what sort of leadership they've got and so on. To get to that election, before they get to that election, ideally they should reform the electoral system because the chances of the current electoral system producing a workable majority are very low indeed. Even though there's a thing called the bonus, which the majority gets of 50-odd seats, it's probably not going to be enough in the new circumstances of great party fragmentation. There's bonus in other countries as well. There's one in Greece, and it actually gave the Greek government a majority, but it probably won't in the Italian context. So, and there are lots of other things wrong with the electoral system, which I can't really list here, but everybody agrees it's not a good system. The problem is, of course, that it's party interests that will decide what the new system is, and those party interests are opposed. So it's quite possible that we shall get to the election without a change, or very much change, in the electoral system. It's perfectly possible on present voting intentions that there won't be a workable majority. Now,
what implications does that have for the election? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, the current voting intentions are that the sort of populist, irresponsible party, the party whose leader is not even going to stand, the Cinque Stelle movement, Mr. Grillo, who's very good at gesture politics but really has no policies, they will get as much as 20% of the vote.
Oh, right.
That's the current voting intentions. It looks at the moment as though a coalition of the left could get up to 45%, and a coalition of the right could get about 35%. I think I'm right in saying that makes 100%. But we have to look at both those coalitions. The coalition of the left is a very broad coalition. Both times that the left has been in power in the last 15 years or so, 1996 and 2006, it's fallen apart within 2 years. It's already arguing about leaders, about all sorts of things, about welfare cuts, and it doesn't really look as though it's a very credible coalition, even though it's 10 points ahead of the right. The right is in some ways even more problematic because it doesn't have a leader at all. Mr. Berlusconi's movement, party, the PDL, is terribly discredited by his own judicial troubles, by corruption scandals, and in the polls they're really way, way down. So it's going to be very difficult for either left or right to put together a majority. And with that 20% taken out, even the bonus probably won't do it.
Right. Now, where does the unelected Prime Minister Mario Monti fall into all of this? Because he has flirted with the idea that he might be willing to serve again, that he might serve but not run. Where does he fall into this whole
Even
mix?
He doesn't know, in the sense that I think in his heart of hearts he probably likes being Prime Minister, and I think he would quite like to go on being Prime Minister. And I think that the uncertainty sometimes makes him feel he probably does have to give an indication that he could be willing to continue as Prime Minister after an inconclusive election. I think market sentiment, if you like, international opinion, needs that kind of reassurance, given that we're looking into a black hole. We just don't know what Italian politics is going to look like after next spring. So I think in some ways it's responsible of Monti to say, OK, I could be persuaded to lend a hand, as he puts it, by which he really means be Prime Minister. And probably that would be of a broad coalition spanning left and right, as his current government does in effect, even though it's unelected. But I think he also would probably quite like to. But there's not much he can do He can't really say, OK, I'm going to descend into politics, I'm going to form a coalition, whoever wants to join me can, as long as it's on reasonable terms, and stand for election and run. All he can do is hope to be called, or expect to be called, or be willing to be called after the election. And I think then, there are probably some interesting questions that follow from that, interesting implications, like his legitimacy, like how long he could do again after the election what he's been doing since last December ahead of the election.
It's a fascinating point. And I mean, what I love is we're focusing with the US election coming up in November on this question of who will win. And the question I guess I have with Italy is anyone going to win?
Yeah. And the probability at the moment is that no one is going to win. Of course, they may change the electoral system, and if they are sensible, but it's difficult to get agreement, they should change it in a way that would increase the probability that somebody does win. How they do that, though, is very, very difficult because Italian public sentiment is very anti-party. And in fact, what's been going on recently, a series of revelations about politicians in the regions, Berlusconi's continuing trouble, it all discredits politicians in quite a serious way. So getting that kind of cohesion back to the broad centre-left, centre-right debate sufficiently for one side or the other to win is very difficult. And it has to be said, at the moment, electorally speaking, that side looks more like it's the left than the right. Well, looking around Europe at the moment, there aren't that many left-wing governments that have stayed in power and stuck out the austerity cuts for very long and survived. And an Italian left-wing government or coalition would be particularly fragile because it's a coalition of several parties, some of whom are pretty demagogic and populist. So one wouldn't want to put much money on the majority, even if it emerges, being terribly cohesive.
Now, what reaction do you think markets are going to have, not only to all the uncertainty leading in the run-up to the election, and we're thinking April, but then if no one wins, if there's no clear winner, how do we see markets responding, particularly if Spain does make that bailout request?
Yeah. Well, I think, as most people observe at the moment, it's a pretty complicated story. Italy manages to hide behind the other players. So, given that it's more or less running a balanced budget, its underlying economy is stronger than the other three Mediterranean economies by some way, you will only start to bet against Italy seriously if you believe that things have really fallen apart domestically, or if you believe that the dominoes are falling over and Italy's next. Now, for a long time, I think we thought if Spain needs to go for a bailout, then that kind of puts the pressure and the focus on Italy. I think that market sentiment right now is changing. And for the time being, I think there'll be a sense of considerable relief if Spain does make the application, even though it'll cost Italy itself a certain amount. I think there'll be a certain amount of relief that this has happened, that Spanish interest rates, as a result, will be coming down, as they are already. And I think that you'll probably see the same in Italy. So actually, a Spanish bailout probably would help the Italian case in the short term. The real issue, as everybody says, is what happens in the medium term. Because the moment that you saw any real resistance on the part of the ECB to continue this unlimited willingness to support Spanish bond markets, at that point, all those people who are currently seeing it as a one-way bet because they can pile back into Spanish bonds, as they are doing right now because they can see the ECB is coming up behind it, will suddenly think, OK, maybe that guarantee isn't quite as good as it looks. Now, that depends, of course, on what happens to those southern European economies. It doesn't really depend on what happens in Italian politics. You can't really, as it were, predict the outcome in Italy in terms of policy management without looking at that wider context. I mean, that's true of all countries, but I think it's particularly true of the Italian case.
Well, thank you so much for juggling the flaming Rubik's Cube that is the Euro crisis, and particularly this dimension of Italian politics, which is so fascinating. We will no doubt be returning to this as we get into the run-up to those elections, but for now we'll say goodbye. If you have any other questions about Europe or matters global or local, get in touch with us here at Oxford Analytica. We're happy to help.